if there is no connection between the registry and this individual,
Then it's irrelevant.
there's no
It's irrelevant.
direct irrelevance.
Hello? Hello? Can anyone hear me? No.
We make special accommodations for visitors of special distinction. But go ahead and sit down here first.
Oh, sit here first, okay.
Now, are you using PowerPoint?
No, I'm just gonna talk.
I'm not a great fan of PowerPoint.
I am.
Well, that's fine, that's fine. Add some diversity.
Fred and I are probably older.
Yeah, I don't like to write everything down.
Am I what?
You're just doing it off the top.
No. I'm
I'm gonna
just,
try.
Okay.
We'll see.
yes, I do. Yes, these are two articles that I wrote.
This is just for people.
If they want to, yeah, this is just for people to pick up. I will invite them up, to get it if they want it, and if they don't, that's fine.
The break that we get after this panel,
Yeah. Right.
which reminds me,
We use static and matrix and all that sort of.
Well, I mean, I think it's helpful for identifying groups that you want to pay particular attention to,
Yeah.
but I don't think it can say anything about the risk of specific individuals within a group.
It's statistics, isn't it?
Right, so if you want to identify a group at risk of a heart attack because your insurance company wants to know that such a group exists, it's helpful. But if to make their money, the insurance companies have to accurately predict who within that group would or wouldn't have a heart attack, they would be getting nowhere. And what I am concerned about with the Static 2000 and a lot of these others is they're using to make decisions about individuals rather than about groups of individuals.
Yeah.
And they're not designed for that.
We're using the stable treatment.
Right. Yeah, again, it's guiding treatment that people
Yeah.
understand. It just gives us a general sense of how we want to approach things. But it gets into court of law, and it looks like it's more scientific than it is. It's very misleading.
Still, when it's the ARC is 70, 72, something like that. You're still 38.
Well, there is, and again, these things get revised over time. The static 99 was used for a long time, and
Yeah.
they identified a high-risk group, but approximately 50% of what they called a high-risk group after 15 years had not recidivated. So if you're trying to predict about people within that group and they're in trial who will or won't recidivate, it's no better than flipping a coin.
Because that's the problem with the statics. The static factors.
No, they're
They don't
designed-
change, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, it is my pleasure to begin again. And in the second part of this morning's presentations, we're going to turn to therapeutic approaches to sex offending. I mean, we've heard about the human rights aspects of how sex offender laws are deployed. But the question still remains, what should we do with and about sex offenders? We can criticize the current ways that the state handles them, but we do need to have a more positive notion of how we help these people reintegrate into society without getting into trouble or harming others. And we're really very privileged to have here today someone who's been a genuine pioneer in this area, and that is Dr. Fred Berlin of the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's, well, this is someone so prominent he hardly even needs an introduction, but he's the founder of the Johns Hopkins Sexual Disorders Clinic and the director of the National Institute for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Sexual Trauma. So this is someone who really understands this question from both sides, from the side of the victim, but also from the side of the sexual paraphiliac, and can really present us with a very balanced and nuanced perspective. Dr. Berlin, please give us the benefit of your many years of wisdom and experience.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that kind introduction. Well, I've been trying to figure out how to put in the context of human rights the work that I ordinarily do, and part of it will just be to trust that the information I give you may be of some value to you, but also as someone who is a clinician who's involved in seeing people commit sex offenses, seeing people who've been victimized, I am reminded that discussions of human rights, or any discussion we're going to have, obviously needs to be put into the larger context. And I would want to start off by indicating, and I think I agree with many of you about some of the things that need to be corrected, about some of what have become abuses in the system. But I don't think it's going to be persuasive to those who need to be persuaded to make change, to leave any sense that some of what's going on may be simply because people are not sufficiently concerned about human rights. There are folks out there who are dangerous. People understandably are frightened. People want to be able to protect children and other vulnerable individuals. I think if we don't acknowledge that that's out there and see it as simply an issue of human rights, we're going to be a little bit behind the eight ball in trying to get people to understand the concerns that we have. I think to get people to understand our concerns, you also have to acknowledge that you appreciate the concerns that they have as well. Now, psychiatry, in talking about some of the abuses, I think often speaks sort of a psychobabble that doesn't really help to educate the public, and I think clearly there are instances in which some of the terms that we use psychiatrically are terribly misused, which I think contributes to some of the abuses that have been discussed here earlier. For example, I'm going to talk a lot about pedophilia here today, which is a psychiatric term. It comes out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and like any other diagnosis, what it was intended to originally, and what's it intended to do for people in my profession, is simply to be a shorthand way of conveying information. But as you know, that is a term that has been turned into a demonizing pejorative, a way of saying that somebody is less than human, far removed from the way in which it's originally meant to be used, and therefore I think we need to regroup and try to put things into a proper context. So with that in mind, I'm really going to talk to you about what I do, how I teach students, medical students, residents, and others to think about the issues that are important when it comes both to sexual misconduct, to conditions such as pedophilia, and then leave it to you to see to the extent that does or doesn't help you in the work and the interests that you may have. Now, to do this, I'm going to divide the comments I make up into 4 sections. So to try to keep it organized, let me give you an overview of those sections, and then I'll back up and run through each of them. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about how I would go about evaluating an individual who has perhaps engaged in behavior that would result in being criminally prosecuted as a sex offender, or in some cases just helping people who are having sexual behaviors that are to themselves very problematic. And so the first part of what I'm going to talk about is assessment, and that's really going to be the bulk of what I discuss because the rest of it is predicated on that as a solid foundation. So number one is what do we do in terms of evaluation? Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about etiology or cause, and because the time is rather limited, I'm going to talk much about pedophilia and what we do and don't know about the cause of that as a disorder. So that's going to be the second area that I'm going to get into. And again, I'll try to relate it as best I can to issues relating to people having the right to be treated fairly and humanely. Thirdly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the rationale for treatment, and I think that's extremely important because there are many folks out there who believe that psychiatrists simply excuse sin by relabeling it psychopathology. And I do think, by the way, that we have to be very careful not to do that. There are people who are of sound mind, who are behaving badly, and we shouldn't simply attach some sort of a psychiatric label and have that used as an excuse for what is the misbehavior of someone who's essentially of sound mind. That said, people very often forget about the other side of the coin, which is where somebody might be struggling and having difficulty behaving in a fully responsible fashion because there are some psychiatric or psychological issues that legitimately are impacting on them in a way that it's important to understand. So I'll get into more detail when I come to that subsequently, but I do want to talk about the rationale for treatment, why terms like diagnosis and treatment may even make sense, in an area which for many is simply an issue of moral misconduct. And then finally, although I'm not going to go into the details of treatment, we have others who will talk a bit more about that, I want to at least make sure that the concepts that are relevant here are spelled out in a way that makes sense. And I also once again want to debunk some of what's out there that I think does have impact in terms of people's concerns about treating people fairly and proper human rights. For example, I'll talk a little bit about some of what's been done in terms of wanting to discuss the issue of castration with sex offenders. And again, that immediately evokes a tremendous emotion. There's clearly going to be a sense of wanting to be concerned that there aren't abuses of human rights. So I will try to present that hopefully in a balanced way that can make some sense for you. Well, let me start off then with the issue of how someone like myself would go about evaluating an individual. And again, I'll try to put it into a forensic setting since we're here at a law school. And so the first point I'll make is that anyone is labeled a sex offender simply because they behaved in a particular way. In other words, there are statutes on the books that forbid a certain kind of behavior. It is against the law in almost all jurisdictions for an adult to have sex with somebody who's under the legal age of consent. And if one behaves in that way and is apprehended and prosecuted, one will then be labeled a sexual offender. There are laws against having sex in a coercive way with an unwilling partner. And again, if one behaves in that way in violation of a statute, that can have one become a convicted sexual offender. The first thing that someone in my shoes has to keep in mind in evaluating an individual who has behaved in an inappropriate or problematic way sexually is to understand that people can engage in similar behaviors for a variety of reasons, and that not everybody who engages in a sex offending behavior is doing so because there's something different or abnormal or atypical about their sexual makeup, something that I'm going to talk about in great detail subsequently. The term that we use in the profession, if somebody's behavior is a reflection of there being something atypical about their sexual makeup, is paraphilia. And therefore, if someone commits a sex offense but has a perfectly conventional or normal sexual makeup, that person would be seen as a non-paraphilic sexual offender. Now, just to give a couple of examples to make sure that what I'm saying is entirely clear. The first example of someone who might commit a sex offense but does not have a sexual disorder might be a man who breaks into a home, he's looking to steal something, finds a woman home alone, and exploits the situation by sexually assaulting her. In the example I'm giving here, he certainly can be prosecuted as being a sexual offender, but there's no reason to assume in this example that he's doing this because there's something atypical about his sexual makeup, because something unusual about his sexual makeup is driving him to do this. He may be doing it because he lacks a sense of conscience and moral responsibility. He may be hopped up on drugs and impaired in his judgment and so on. But the point I want to make is that he would be an example of someone who's a sex offender who does not have anything different or unusual about his sexual makeup. I'll give just one other category of example, because the bulk of what I want to talk about subsequently then has to do with differences in human sexual makeup and how that impacts in terms of the issues that I need to address. But let me give you a second example, just because I think it's important, of individuals who commit a non-paraphilic sexual offense, and that has to do with some of the problems that are faced by mentally retarded individuals. For many years, since I developed a program to address these issues at Hopkins many, many years ago, one of the groups of individuals that we've tried to work with are the mentally retarded. And I suspect most of us spend little time thinking about what it must be like to have the mental age of an 8-year-old and yet the intensity of sexual desire that most of us experience as adults. Beyond that, if one does have the mental age of an 8-year-old, how is one going to persuade an adult to become involved in an intimate sexual liaison? None of us want to be sexually intimate, presumably, with someone who has the mental age of a child. And so it's for the reasons I'm talking about here, the limited coping skills, the availability of an age-appropriate partner, that some mentally retarded individuals will persuade, or even in rare cases coerce, a child who may be of exactly the same mental age into sexual activity. Now again, if they're not seen as so limited intellectually as to be seen not competent to stand trial or to not be seen as criminally responsible, the individuals that I'm talking about in this example could be prosecuted as sex offenders. But that does not mean that they have pedophilia. It does not mean that we should be understanding their behavior as coming out of something that is different about their sexual makeup. So again, I'm going to talk about that in great detail. I also want to emphasize here that it's why we should not, an example of why I feel we throw around the word pedophilia far too loosely, and I'll come back and explain that shortly. But at this point, it seems as though every time we hear about an adult who's had sex with a minor who's under the age of consent, we get this word pedophilia bandied about, and that clearly is something that ought not to be happening. So the first take-home point then, and I'm just going to leave it at that, is there are many people who engage in sexually inappropriate behaviors or who commit sexual offenses who are not sexually disordered, to use that term, or who do not have something different about their sexual makeup. Now, in order to talk about the group I want to focus on today, which will ultimately include people with pedophilia, I want to talk about that subgroup of individuals who are predisposed to engage in problematic sorts of sexual activities, not because they're mentally retarded, not because they lack a sense of conscience and moral responsibility, not because they're impaired in their judgment by drugs or alcohol, but they're predisposed because there's something fundamentally different about their sexual makeup. And in order to talk about that, I want to talk about the diversity of human sexuality for a moment. We're all taught from the time that we're very young that everyone is created equal. And certainly, if we're talking about equality of opportunity, if we're talking about equal moral rights, I would agree that everyone should be thought of as equal. But we're not all created equal if equal means the same. Some of us are more gifted intellectually than others. Some of us more athletic or musical aptitude than others. And we can go on and on. And one of the many ways in which human beings differ from one another in terms of diversity is in their sexual makeup. And I'm going to talk today about 4 ways in which people differ from one another sexually and tie those into the various paraphilic disorders that are listed in the DSM, and hopefully in a way that would make some sense for you. Let me go through those 4 ways then, and then I'll give a couple of examples in each of those categories. First, people differ tremendously from one another in terms of the kinds of behaviors that they either do or do not find to be erotically arousing, sexually arousing, or another way of saying it is people differ with respect to the kind of behaviors that they do or don't crave sexually. So behavior is number 1. That's the first category. Secondly, people differ with respect to the kinds of partners, for lack of a better word, or individuals that they would or wouldn't be attracted to sexually. So the category of individuals, partners, I'm not sure what the best word is, but that's kind of a second way in which people differ from one another in the sexual arena. Thirdly, people differ from one another in the intensity of sexual desire that they experience. The first 2 examples I gave you were qualitative differences in sexual makeup, but there's also an intensity dimension which is very important to appreciate. Some people want sex a lot. It's on their mind frequently. They feel rather driven sexually. For others, much less so. And then finally and fourthly, although it doesn't have to do with sexual makeup per se, people differ in their attitudes about their own sexual feelings. Now, let me break this down and back up and go through some of these categories and relate them to issues that are important clinically and perhaps be of some use to you in the issues you're trying to address. The first way in which I said people differ from one another was with respect to the kinds of behaviors that they either do or don't find to be sexually appealing. And the first example I'm going to give of that is not terribly important from a forensic or criminal justice point of view, but I'm going to give it just to make a simple teaching point, and that's a paraphilia that is called transvestitic fetishism. As I said, I like to stay away from the jargon, so in everyday English, we're talking about a condition in which what really turns an individual on sexually is dressing and clothing of the opposite gender. In most cases, just for simplicity here, I'll tell you if I want to do it otherwise, I'm going to be talking about a man. So in terms of making this simple and giving you a clinical example, we're talking about men who are very aroused by dressing and clothing of the opposite gender. Now, again, I believe very much in research and data and so on, and I don't want to make light of the importance of that, but there's still much to be learned by simple clinical vignettes, and I want to give you one here to make some teaching points that I'm going to follow through with in a moment. And so this is an example of a man that I saw when I was very young in my residency training who was admitted to an inpatient psychiatric unit because he had recently had a very mild stroke about 2 weeks earlier, and then following that stroke he'd become very depressed, and that's why he was being admitted to the inpatient psychiatric unit. What was depressing him, though, was not the fact that he had this stroke. He'd made a full recovery. It wasn't an area of the brain that has to do with causing depression. What was depressing this gentleman so badly was that, or so seriously, was that during the brief period when he'd been hospitalized, his wife of many years had found secreted in the closet a cachet of female clothing. And he felt compelled to admit to her for years. It had been something he was too embarrassed to ever tell her, that in private he would dress up in this way, he would be very aroused by it, he would masturbate while doing so, and he just had been worried, and worried very seriously what would happen if anybody ever found out that this had been occurring. And again, he was coming into the inpatient unit in psychiatry wondering, A, if his wife of many years would leave him, what would happen to his reputation if this got out. He was also very worried about his occupation. I think at the time he was in his early 70s, but he hadn't quite yet retired. And his occupation, he felt, would be devastated if this got out because he was a very prominent local pediatrician. Now, the example I'm giving you here, it's transvestitic fetishism, has nothing to do about pedophilia. I'll get to that shortly. And there isn't a shred of reason to think that this man would have posed a risk to any of the pediatric patients that he was caring for. But all of us being human beings, the fact of the matter is we react as much to our emotions as we do to our intellect. And the truth is that many of us, if we'd found out that our child's pediatrician was behaving in this way, would have had second thoughts about continuing to take our child to that individual for treatment. Now, one of the points I want to drive home here is that even though this man was devastated, worried about ruining his reputation, losing his marriage, losing his ability to continue practicing as a pediatrician, he was still not sure, even in the face of all of that, that he was going to be able to keep himself from giving into the temptation periodically of again engaging in this cross-dressing behavior. Now, if one were to read the DSM, and I'm going to stay away from most of the technical parts of it, but if one were to look in the diagnostic manual at what is the psychological essence of any of what they call the paraphilic disorders, is that the individual with the condition experiences intense, recurrent, sexually arousing fantasies and urges about something, and in the case of transvestitic fetishism, that something is wearing the clothing of the opposite gender. Now, I would suggest to you that any man is physically capable of putting on women's clothing, but it is ludicrous to suggest that the average man experiences intense, recurrent, sexually arousing fantasies and urges about doing so to the point where it becomes a daily struggle not to do so. And so I'm going to build on this later because it's one thing when you're having a difficult time resisting the temptation of cross-dressing. It can be quite another thing in terms of society and the concerns of others if the temptation that you're not able to easily resist is recurrent fantasies and urges about having sex with an 8-year-old child. I'll come to that, but I'm trying to lay the foundation for where I'm going. I'll just give one other example of a paraphilia based on the first category I mentioned, which is behavior, and that is exhibitionism. And again, I want to emphasize that although the law can define someone as a criminal, as a sex offender, because of their behavior alone, they violated a statute by behaving in a particular way, that is not how we would arrive at a diagnosis from the mental health perspective. So again, to give a simple example, the man who moons the crowd at the Saturday afternoon football game, pulls down his crowd and exposes himself to the crowd, probably in a drunken state, can certainly be arrested and prosecuted for genital exposure, but we would certainly not suggest that that act in and of itself qualifies him for a diagnosis of the paraphilic condition of exhibitionism. Again, in the example I just gave earlier, any man, I presume, is physically capable of exposing himself in public, but to suggest that the average man experiences intense, recurrent, sexually arousing fantasies and urges about exposing to the point where it's a daily struggle not to do so would be to make a comment that is clearly nothing that can be substantiated. Now, we published a paper many years ago on over 100 men who'd been arrested for exhibitionism, many of them frequently. I've never taken the time to total this up. I can assure you that if I'd have totaled the number of times those 100, I think it was 111 exhibitionists had exposed themselves, it had been probably well over 1,000 times. Many of them had been arrested more than once. They'd been publicly embarrassed and humiliated. They're in a courtroom like this where everybody's hearing what they've done, and yet the recurrence of these urges is such that often their resolve weakens, they give in, and they repeat the behavior, and without treatment, they often are not able to succeed. Again, might make an important point in terms of being in a courtroom that much of our approach to paraphilic disorders, the conditions I'm going to be talking about today, has come from the legislative point of view without much consultation with the scientific medical community. I think that's one of the problems here. And so we think one more law, one more tougher sentence, and so on, is going to solve it. If somebody goes to prison because they're having intense, recurrent, atypical sexual urges, there's nothing about prison alone that can either erase those urges or B, enhance their capacity to deal successfully with them. And sooner or later, like it or not, many of these people are going to come back out into the community. So I don't want to suggest for a moment that we don't need to have a firm criminal justice approach to matters. We do. But nobody would think, if we have laws about drunk driving, that that's all we should do is have laws, put these people on a registry, and not have research into factors that contribute to the development of alcoholism, not have treatment for people who are struggling with their cravings they may be experiencing for alcohol, and so on. So I'm a bit on a side here, but I want it to be understood. If you appreciate what the phenomenon is that we're dealing with, the notion that we can keep passing more laws, tougher sentences, and so on, I would argue starts to become extremely primitive. Now, I could give you, but I won't, other examples of paraphilias based on the kind of behavior that someone craves. Let me move on to the second area, which is the kind of partners that people are interested in sexually. And again, I'm going to start with sort of the examples that are useful for teaching purposes, and then get into the larger picture, which I think is of concern to many of you. The first example I'll give of a paraphilia based on the fact that someone is craving sex with an atypical kind of partner is zoophilia. And this is a condition in which the kind of person, entity that the individual is drawn to sexually is an animal. Now, again, the last thing presumably that most of you are experiencing when I talk about animals is a sense of sexual excitement or sexual yearning. To the contrary, what you're experiencing is a sense of revulsion, disgust, distaste, whatever term you want to use. But this is exactly the point that I want to make. That the kind of prospective partner who for one person can be an incredible turn on, for another person can be an incredible turn off, making it clear just how diverse the spectrum of human sexuality actually is. When I used to give a talk of this nature several years ago, I discussed how rare this must be, this condition that we're referring to as zoophilia or bestiality, the various terms that are used. And I'm sure, by the way, that relatively speaking, it's still fairly rare. But what's new since I began to talk about some of these issues in recent years is the internet. And I often make the point that the internet, I think, is like atomic energy. You can use it to light the world, or you can use it to blow up the world. It's got two very different sides to it. And one of the things that, and I don't know if this is the good side or the bad side, I'm seeing a lot of problems for people out of the internet, child pornography and so on, for example. but it also can be informative. And one of the things I found to be rather remarkable is just how many people on a daily basis go to sites on the internet that cater to having sexual interests or fascinations about animals. You know, we can sit next to people day in and day out and get some sense of their character, their temperament, and their personality. We have no idea about what the privacy of their sexual makeup, and we tend not to want to talk about that, certainly not in a public setting. But the internet is giving us a window into that, and clearly just substantiating the point that I'm making here, there's a tremendous diversity of human sexuality. Sometimes that can be a source of tremendous pleasure, which we ought to respect, but sometimes it can create tremendous burdens, which I'm going to talk about here. And certainly we need to stop sweeping it under the carpet and, in my opinion, deal with it much more thoughtfully than the kind of knee-jerk reaction way in which we've been doing so often recently. Now, I gave that example just to talk about a type of partner that people are attracted to that shows that level of diversity. There are other conditions, for example, people who are very turned on by being sexual with corpses. I testified in one of the most notorious trials about that, Jeffrey Dahmer, a man who was almost incapable of having sex with people who were alive and had these intense recurrent fantasies and urges about having sex with individuals who were deceased. Again, I won't have time to go into that now. If people are interested, I can make some literature available to you on that. But what I really want to talk about today is the category that is of such concern for society nowadays, and which I said earlier is so, I think, misunderstood, and that is pedophilia. And again, let me start, because I want to put this in as clear a context as I can, once again making a point I alluded to earlier, that just because an adult has had sex with someone under the age of consent does not mean that that person is going to qualify for the diagnosis of pedophilia from the psychiatric perspective. If, for example, I'm a father who has sex, let's say, with my 13-year-old stepdaughter who maybe looks like she's 18 years old, I can be prosecuted criminally for child sexual abuse and end up as a convicted felon. But that does not mean that I did this because there's something atypical about my sexual makeup. Again, I may have done it because I don't have the necessary moral principles guiding my life. I may have done it as someone who was hopped up on drugs or alcohol. I may have been a person who was confused and lonely and inappropriately turned to my child in ways I never should have in the first place. And I go on and on and on. But the point I want to make is that simply because an adult has had sex with a minor does not mean we should loosely throw around the term pedophilia. So what have I found to be the easiest way to define, in a manner that I hope is understandable, what I as a physician would mean if I make a diagnosis of pedophilia? Well, as I said earlier, it's just a shorthand way of conveying information. So let's talk about what information it conveys. First of all of us could define for other individuals, if we talked about this more openly, both a gender of partner and an age range of partner that we either are or not attracted to in a sexual way. And because these are personal matters, and I certainly would want to respect people's privacy, I wouldn't dream of calling for volunteers. I'll use myself as an example. If you ask me to talk about the gender of partner that I'm attracted to, I have no difficulty whatsoever in telling you that. In my case, it happens to be female. It doesn't make me better or worse than anyone else. I'm not making any moral judgments, but for whatever reason, I can tell you that's the category of individual, the gender of individuals that I'm attracted to. I can go beyond that, though, and I can tell you an age range of female that either would or would not tempt me in a sexual way. For example, at the upper end of that range, and I always have to look around and not offend anybody when I do this, but I'm not struggling to keep myself from having sex with a 90-year-old woman, and I don't refrain from having sex with 90-year-old women simply because I'm a chauvinist who has something against the elderly. I'm simply not tempted to have sex with a woman of that age. At the lower end of the spectrum, though, and this is the much more important part, I don't refrain from having sex with 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old children simply because I'm a moral person. I very much hope that I'm a moral person. I believe I'm a moral person. But the fact of the matter is, never in my life have I felt tempted to have sex with a child of that age. I have 4 children of my own. All of them have gone well past that age that I'm talking about in the examples I'm giving here. Like any father, when they were younger, I enjoyed expressing affection in an appropriate physical way, holding them, hugging them. At no time was I saying to myself, be careful, watch out for those feelings. There were no feelings of sexual temptation. At no point was I saying, don't get yourself in trouble. There's laws out there. It was a non-issue. Now, there's other people, if I'm going to ask them to describe the gender of partner and the age range of partner that they're attracted to in a sexual way, are going to say something very different than what I just said. And if we don't want to believe them, there's a device called the penile plethysmograph. You put a little strain gauge around the penis, you show them pictures, little boys, little girls, men, women, and you can physiologically actually document the gender and age range that does or doesn't turn them on in a sexual fashion. There are some individuals who indicate that they are sexually attracted to prepubescent children. Now, as I said earlier, a psychiatric diagnosis is just a shorthand way of conveying information. That's all any medical diagnosis is. If I, as a physician, tell another physician I've diagnosed diabetes, it tells you certain things that are important to know, and there's certain things it doesn't tell you. If I tell you as a psychiatrist I've diagnosed schizophrenia, it conveys some information. It doesn't tell you certain other sorts of information. So I'm going to expand on this, but to start off in the simplest of terms, when I say as a psychiatrist I've diagnosed pedophilia, all that tells you is that the individual that I'm talking about here today is an individual who finds prepubescent children to be a source of sexual arousal. Now, I'm going to get into a further distinction subsequently that's made in the DSM-5 of just because I have those attractions, does that mean I have a disorder? If I forget to do that, someone should remind me. But right now, I'm just talking about what the term pedophilia means, and all that it means is this is an individual who's sexually attracted to prepubescent children. Now, we can further divide the cake when it comes to pedophilia, and one way has to do with the gender of partner that the individual is attracted to. So let's assume I'm talking about a man. If it's a man attracted to boys, that same gender, or homosexual pedophilia. If it's a man attracted to girls, that's opposite gender, or heterosexual pedophilia. If it's a man attracted to both boys and girls, that's bisexual pedophilia. That's one way of dividing the cake. The other way of dividing the cake, and you'll see this in the DSM if you look it up, has to do with whether or not the person who's attracted to children is only attracted to children, or does that individual have some degree of attraction to adults, but in addition to that attraction to adults, he experiences these intense recurrent fantasies and urges about prepubescent youngsters. If an individual is attracted only to prepubescent children and not to adults, that is the exclusive form of pedophilia because by definition, that person is attracted exclusively to children. If that person has some degree of attraction to adults, but is also feeling very strong attractions to children of the sort that we never experience, that is considered to be the non-exclusive form of pedophilia. Now, the question sometimes comes up, and I'm going to get to the substance when I talk about treatment. Well, look, it seems like the person with the non-exclusive form of pedophilia has a choice, that they could become involved with adults, they could become involved with children. Why, for God's sakes, don't they simply do the right thing and conform their behaviors to the expected standards? Well, there's going to be many, many answers to that question, but one of the points I'm going to want to make as I go along is that sex is a powerful, biologically based appetite. And appetites have within them certain tastes. I can, for example, finish a big turkey dinner, and I don't really want any more turkey, but I'm still having a difficult time passing up the temptation to have that piece of strawberry shortcake for dessert. That's the problem, the dilemma faced by the person with a non-exclusive form of pedophilia. Obviously not in terms of consequences, I don't want to be misunderstood, but in terms of mental experience. The fact that that person is capable of interacting with an adult doesn't erase the fact that they are still much more tempted sexually by children than are the rest of us, and that they still need to learn how to deal with those temptations in their own right. And so these people are not out of the woods just simply thinking, well, they could easily go with adults. It doesn't make any sense. If I'm being clear in explaining it, they still have a problem independent of the fact that they're able to relate intimately to an adult in an adult situation. I'm going to jump around a little bit, and I'll try to make sure I keep it on focus. So I've talked about how people differ in terms of the kinds of behaviors that they do or don't crave sexually. I talked about the kinds of differences that people have because of the kind of partners that they do or don't find to be sexually exciting. I then said the third way people differ from one another is intensity of sexual drive. I'm going to skip that for the moment. The fourth way in which I said people differ from one another is in their attitude about their own sexual desires. There are some people who are sexually attracted to children who feel that they should be allowed to act on those attractions, that there's no conflict between the fact that they experience those attractions and and their personal beliefs about right or wrong, about whether or not they should be allowed to act on those attractions. If the attractions that a person experiences for children are not in conflict with their personal sense of right and wrong, if they feel it should be acceptable to act on those attractions are said to be ego-syntonic. Now, there's other individuals who are sexually attracted to children, and it's a terrible contradiction. They may still have the temptations, they may even have given in to them, but if metaphorically speaking, they could remove whatever part of their brain is responsible for them having these kinds of urges, they would do it in a moment. When the desires that a person experiences are in conflict with their personal sense of right and wrong, they are said to be ego-dystonic. Now, I said I'd stay away from psychobabble, but I want to give you an example here of why what may seem like psychobabble isn't, and how it's simply intended to convey useful information. So I'm going to break my own rule here for a moment and say, let's suppose that I'm presenting to you a patient today. This is a male that I brought with you as a person that I've had in treatment, and I've made a diagnosis of him, and the diagnosis that I've made is ego-dystonic homosexual pedophilia of the exclusive type. And again, I'll do it slowly, but it can certainly, for the uninitiated, sound like a lot of psychobabble. So I said ego-dystonic homosexual pedophilia of the exclusive type. So let's break it down. First of all, I told you the gentleman I'm presenting here today has pedophilia. So the first piece of information I've given you is to tell you he is attracted sexually to prepubescent children. Now keep in mind, I'm not getting into debates about age of consent. I'm not talking about teenagers here. I'm not talking about Romeo and Juliet. That's not what pedophilia is as we use it psychiatrically. I'm telling you by saying pedophilia, this is a man who's sexually attracted to prepubescent children. I then said it was homosexual pedophilia. So he's attracted to boys, to prepubescent boys. Thirdly, I've told you that it is the exclusive form of homosexual pedophilia. So he's not attracted to girls, he's not attracted to women, and very importantly, by the way, he's not attracted to men. He is not gay. I had the opportunity to work as a consultant for the Catholic Church when they were having their difficulties. I was asked to be a consultant to the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. I was also appointed to the Cardinal's Commission for the Protection of Children in Boston, and that gave me an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the issues. And one of the first mistakes that the church made, to go a little bit off on the side for a moment, was they originally defined the problem as the gay problem. Many of the men who, particularly the ones who were currently involved, many of the priests who were currently involved sexually with prepubescent children, had no interest whatsoever in being sexual with males their own age. They had the exclusive form of pedophilia, and there's no way. There's plenty of guys that would have been sexual with them. They didn't have the slightest interest, so it wasn't the gay problem. It was also the case, and I won't go into detail here, that the church in the early days was one of the first institutions to recognize they had problems in terms of what was happening to children, and were referring the priests to the experts of the day, psychiatrists, who back then were saying they were curing pedophilia, reassuring the bishops. The bishops think he's cured, it's okay for him to be out there, and then further problems ensued. Again, to get a little bit ahead of myself, we don't cure alcoholism, we can successfully treat it, but one of the ways we successfully treat it is to not encourage alcoholics to spend unnecessary time around places where they can easily get access to booze. So again, it's a bit of an aside, I won't go into it, but there's been a bit of church bashing here that I think was perhaps to some extent undeserved. All right, so I've described then what pedophilia is. I want to get into a little bit, because sometimes I've found over the years in teaching that it's not only about trying to convey clear information to help people understand what we are dealing with, but also to disabuse people of information that gets out there that often turns out to be incorrect. One of the important distinctions that has been made in the recent revisions of the diagnostic manual is to distinguish issue A, what is someone like in terms of their sexual makeup and the issues that may be presented to them because of their sexual makeup, from issue B, what are they like in terms of character, temperament, personality, and so on. And hopefully I can explain this in a way that is very clear, But I can assure you that in the early versions of the diagnostic manual, this was terribly confused. And in fact, in the very early versions, all of what we now call the paraphilias were seen as aspects of antisocial personality disorder. And back then, because improperly we were calling homosexuality a paraphilic disorder, we use different terms, perversion and so on, everyone who was gay was thought to be antisocial. Again, coming back to what information is conveyed by a diagnosis. If I said to you, using these quotes, my diagnosis in terms of telling you something about my sexual makeup is heterosexuality, what information would that convey and what information would it not convey? What it would convey to you is that I'm a man who's attracted to women, and at my age you'd be very safe to assume I've acted on that attraction. But it wouldn't tell you if I'm kind or cruel, caring or not caring, introverted or extroverted, generally responsible or generally irresponsible. That all has to be assessed entirely in its own right. What that means is that the issue with someone that I would diagnose as pedophilia is that they are attracted sexually to prepubescent children, and they may be asking for help or needing help if they're not able to be in control and resisting those temptations. But it does not mean that they're a person without characterological virtue. They may be, in every aspect of their life, a very decent individual. And that's what when I said earlier, the way in which the society is now demonized. You can't watch Law and Order or Criminal Minds without the most vile thing being said about somebody is they have pedophilia, when in reality, what we're really talking about is someone having a different kind of sexual makeup, and where perhaps we ought to understand the ways in which that impacts upon them and see if they do or don't need help and step back and become enlightened rather than simply demonizing and moving off in that other direction. Again, then, when I tell you someone has pedophilia, it does not mean they're antisocial. It doesn't mean they lack a sense of concern. It doesn't mean they don't have a conscience. It has nothing to do with any of that. Can they, in addition to having pedophilia, also be sociopathic? Sure. So can plenty of heterosexual people. But that doesn't mean that these two are somehow inevitably linked. The last thing, and I said I'd take the bulk of the time on assessment, so the last conceptual point, as you see, I'm just trying to get the concepts across I want to make, has to do with some of the things that are out there in the literature that I want to debunk, and that is two theories. One is pedophilic behavior is really not about sex, it's about power and control. That's the one theory, and many of you may have heard that. As you know, this all gets very politicized, and a lot of what goes on in the sexual arena is seen as power and control. And there are people who abuse power, but I want to explain why that's what we're not talking about here. The other theory that has been out there for a long time about pedophilic behavior is that these are just guys that lack social skills. They don't know how to hack it with an adult. Kids are easier, and that's why they turn to kids. Now, what about these two theories that have been in many of the old psychiatric and psychological textbooks? The two theories, power and control, lacking social skills. What couldn't they account for when we talk about pedophilia in the way that I'm discussing it here? And what they can't possibly account for, and it's a mature audience, so I'll put it very bluntly, is they can't explain what it is that causes the man to get an erection. Now, what do I mean by that? If a man with perfectly conventional heterosexual interests is alone fantasizing about the kind of partner that causes him to get an erection, he's fantasizing about an adult female. If a man with the exclusive form of homosexual pedophilia is alone fantasizing about the kind of partner that causes him to get an erection, he's fantasizing about a prepubescent boy. That's not about power and control. That's not about lacking social skills. That's about a fundamental difference in sexual makeup. And if we fail to understand that, and that's why I'm trying to make it clear that people are understanding what the concepts mean, if we don't understand that, we can get ourselves into serious trouble. Or the way in which we understand issues has consequences. I can tell you for years, one of the standard treatments for people with pedophilia was to give them social skills training. And all that you had by the time you were done doing that is someone who was still sexually attracted to prepubescent children who was probably better capable of approaching a child sexually than they ever had been before you gave him that treatment in the first place. Okay? Now, again, there's a lot more I could say on concepts. We'll have a little time for a question, but I've been given a generous amount of time, I think 50 minutes, but I don't want to abuse that. So let me move on to the second section, a section of what I want to talk to, and that's etiology. And people are going to ask the question, and I'll stick to the pedophilia. There just isn't time to go into all the paraphilias, but the concepts are one to get across here. people will start and ask, what is it that causes someone to develop pedophilia? And it's always bothered me that we are starting at the wrong place, because we used to ask the question, some people I guess still do, well, what is it that causes people to develop homosexuality? Why is it we're not backing up and just asking, what are the factors that contribute to any of us having the sexual desires that we do? Why is it that I am somebody who's attracted to members of the opposite gender? Why is it that there are other people who are attracted to adult members of the same gender? Why is it there's some people who find animals to be attractive or who find children to be attractive? We sort of start with the assumption that anything that is different from me is pathological. As I said earlier, there's a tremendous diversity of human sexuality. And if you're going to ask what are the factors that contribute to developing pedophilia, in a sense, you're asking what are the factors that contribute to me becoming heterosexual? And there's an awful lot we don't know about that. So let me just give you 3 categories of answers when it comes to this question of pedophilia. And the first one is the one I think it's going to be most important. I'm going to talk about nature and nurture. Everyone says, is it due to nature, is it due to nurture? I'm going to address that in a minute. But the most important thing that I think people need to understand, if we're going to deal with people who are attracted sexually to children, humanely and fairly and justly, is what their attractions are not due to. And that is to emphasize for everyone that they're not due to voluntary choice. Now, just to be sure I'm absolutely clear what I mean about that. When I was a little boy, at no point did I sit down and say to myself, look, you're going to grow up, you've got to think about your options. Do you want to grow up to be attracted to women? Well, that's pretty conventional. You want to grow up to be attracted to men? I don't know, maybe I want to do something a little more kinky. Maybe I'll decide to grow up to be attracted to little boys or little girls. In growing up, I never sat down in a premeditated way, decided who I was going to be attracted to sexually. In growing up, I discovered who it is I'm attracted to sexually. And certainly in our society, my life is a lot less difficult than it would otherwise been, having discovered that I'm attracted to females my own age or in the adult range. Similarly, I've talked to many men over the years, and I'm just picking this category as a simple teaching example because it's clearly so different from the norm. I've talked to many men who are exclusively attracted to prepubescent boys. Not a one of them ever sat down and decided that they wanted to be different in that way. Like the rest of us, they discovered this to be the nature of their sexual makeup, and they, unlike the rest of us, are then having to cope in life from a very different perspective. Now, the argument I'm making here, to be clear, is it's not my fault I have pedophilia. It is going to be my responsibility to do something about it. But as with drug addiction and alcoholism, for some people at least with pedophilia, doing something about it may require getting access to appropriate medical and psychiatric treatment. Now, the point I said I'd make, and then I want to move on to the nature and nurture thing, is that a distinction has now been made that I think is a good one in the DSM between pedophilia and a pedophilic disorder. And again, for people who are interested, I wrote a paper at one time entitled, "When is a Difference a Disorder?" And just because people are different shouldn't mean that they have a disorder. In fact, in medicine, you can often, in physical medicine, you can be different and not have a disorder. Some people, for example, will have one blue eye and one green eye. That's very different from the norm. Why isn't there a diagnosis in any of the medical manuals about people who are different in that way? There's no diagnosis because diagnoses actually, although we don't think about it, are tied to our value judgments. We diagnose something because we don't like it. We usually in medicine diagnose it because either A, it causes suffering, or B, it impairs functioning. If someone came to this planet from Mars and was just describing various kinds of biological phenomenon, they could say there's different kinds of biological phenomena. There's respiration, people breathe in and out. There's rapid cellular proliferation, and they could go on and on and on, and they just say these are the differences that we're observing on this planet Earth. Well, we have a name for rapid cellular regeneration here. We call it cancer because, again, it's just a different biological phenomenon, but it impairs functioning, it debilitates people, it causes suffering. We call it a disorder. The DSM has now said, to stick to the pedophilia example, if you're sexually attracted to children, but you're not personally distressed by it, you're not impaired in your ability to be in control of yourself, we are not going to say you have a disorder. You're just different from the norm. It's different. It's okay to say you're different. That's not a bad thing. But we're not going to say that just because you're different, you have a disorder. And the example I gave earlier, which would be easier to understand, of transvestitic fetishism, if you enjoy putting on these clothes and like doing it, it doesn't distress you, it gives you pleasure. If you don't want to do it, you can stop it. You're not impaired in your ability to be in control. You're different in your makeup. I don't have recurrent urges to cross-dress, but just because you do, that doesn't mean you're disordered. But as often when we see clinically, somebody's really distressed. I don't want to be doing this. This is putting my life in jeopardy. I don't want to be cross-dressing. I don't know how to stop it, and it's distressing me, and I'm not in control of myself. Then it becomes a disorder. So if somebody's happy doing it, they're not hurting other people, they're in control. I don't think anybody wants psychiatry or the government into the privacy of consenting behaviors that occur in somebody's bedroom. But where non-consenting people are involved or innocent people are hurt, the government does say we have a right to protect children. I agree with much was said earlier. You can abuse that and go too far. And psychiatry, again, is not trying to be the mind police or to tell people they can't be different. But when we see people who are out of control, we see people who are distressed and suffering, they're asking us for help, and we want to try to be of assistance. Now, nature and nurture, very quickly. Obviously, I could talk for hours on each of these. I'm going to go very quickly on the nature side. I personally believe that eventually we're going to understand much more about the biology that accounts for differences in sexual makeup. I suspect that there are biological factors that are very important in why I'm heterosexual. I think there's probably a strong biology in why some people are gay, and there's probably going to be a strong biology related to why some people have pedophilia, and there's some fascinating research going on now that I think is going to support that. Again, there's just anecdotes. I mean, I supported, there's a case in Florida that I was in support of gays being allowed to adopt children, and the argument the other side was making was that, they don't like people being gay, so all these gays that are raising children, they're going to end up with gay kids, and we don't want more gay kids in the world. That's preposterous. The overwhelming majority of gay youngsters were raised in heterosexual homes. If you're sort of going to be influenced to become heterosexual, that should have happened by being raised in those homes. So again, I could give a long lecture on this, but I think, and this is speculation, but I think it's going to turn out to be the case, that biology is going to be where we're getting most of the answers eventually about some differences in sexual makeup, but I don't have the time to go into that. I do want to touch briefly, though, on the nurture side, because, again, there's so much misunderstanding about this. I've heard people say, because you'll hear someone with pedophilia talk about the fact that they themselves had been active with an adult when they were children, that they're making up the abuse excuse. Sure, these guys are in trouble now, and they want to get off the hook by getting sympathy, and they just want to be now seen as victims. How do we decide if something is or is not a risk factor for developing a particular condition? Let me talk about cigarette smoking and lung cancer, and then I'll come over to this issue of if I was, and I'll use the word abused, I know some people have problems with it, but if I was abused sexually, does that predispose me developing pedophilia or becoming an abuser?
Fred, we're just about out of
Oh,
time.
okay, well
so
then
let's
let
wrap
me
it up.
go quick, because I probably covered the more important areas. So 3 or 4 minutes be good?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, all right. So if we look at everyone who smokes and ask, do most of them get lung cancer, the answer is absolutely no. And the cigarettes companies want us to stop there and say, see, smoking is not a risk factor for lung cancer. But if we look at everyone who has lung cancer and ask whether or not they're smokers, the overwhelming majority are. And so it's very clear that smoking is a risk factor for the development of lung cancer. Why some people aren't affected by smoking that way, we'd like to learn more about, but many are. It's now clear that if we look at a group of adults who were sexually active as children, the overwhelming majority of them don't turn out to have pedophilia. In fact, thank goodness, many of them are doing quite nicely. But if we do look at a group of people who have pedophilia, disproportionately, they were people who were active sexually during childhood. So we're not saying that the cause of pedophilia is having been active with an adult during childhood, but it does seem to increase the likelihood of that happening. I'll get into I'll avoid some of the discussions that occurred here earlier. The last point I'll make, just because we're out of time, is that I said I'd say something about castration. None of us as physicians want to be punitive. None of us want to castrate sex offenders. I think a lot of what's going out there is terrible. But some people who are attracted sexually to children, I said it's an appetite. They're hungering sexually for children. And if we can at least make them less hungry, if we can give them the effect of a sexual appetite suppressant, and they're really trying their best maybe that'll enable them to succeed and live more safely in society. You can make people less hungry by lowering testosterone. The old way was to remove the testes, which is castration. I would never favor that, but we can do that pharmacologically. I don't want to impose it on anyone. What bothers me, and I will stop with this, is that I get letters from men around the country who have pedophilia. They want to be able to live safely in the community and be in control. They want to have access to medicines that might make it easier for them to do so, and they're not able to get them. And so I find it ironic. We're in a society that wants to oppose this upon unwilling people who may not need it and don't want it, while at the same time the society is denying people who want it and may benefit from it from having an opportunity to get something that will enable them to have a life for themselves and become productive and safe. So I apologize if I went a bit over on the time, but hopefully that's been of some help to you. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you very much.
To get a European perspective, we have invited Dr. Jules Mulder from the Netherlands, who is a forensic psychologist and involved with a group called Stop It Now. His practice is almost exclusively devoted to treating adults who are minor attracted. So let's hear his perspective.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here, because that gives me the chance to tell you a little bit about the prevention programs we are running and enjoy the real Austin weather, which reminds me a lot of home. I'd like to start off with showing you a short commercial that we made in Holland for the Stop It Now, for the prevention program. And it ties in rather well with what you were just saying.
Jules, can you click on something to make that show on the full
I
screen?
will, because this is a different picture that we're going to have here. Let's see, here's the big one. Here we go.
My name is Frank, and I'm a pedophile. I feel attracted to children under 13, just like 150,000 other Dutchmen. I didn't choose to have these feelings. I was born this way. However, I never approached children with sexual intentions. I'm against that. But because I could never talk about these feelings, I got more and more confused. I'm glad I heard of Stop It Now, an anonymous helpline. I'm feeling better now, and I have my feelings under control. That's why I want to ask everybody who has these feelings to call Stop It Now. Start a conversation and call Stop It Now. Because child sexual abuse should not exist.
Okay, we had this commercial on Dutch television, I think 30, 40 times now. And it's very special to be able to, let me see the slideshow, right? To be able to tell people about being a pedophile without offending. And you can find this film on YouTube as well. It's a real Dutch accent that the guy has, but the message is clear. I'll tell you a bit about how I got in this business, because I've been in the treatment of sex offenders and of child molesters and of child porn downloaders nowadays, about the last 20 years. And what is this pedophilia that we're talking about? I think Dr. Ferreira said about 1 to 3%, only 1 to 3% of men have this pedophilic urge, have sexual interest with children. I say, but it's 1 to 3% of all men between 20 and 70 have these feelings. In Holland, that's between 60 and 180,000 men. These are not all men in prison. These are not all men in treatment. I guess most of them, maybe 10% is in treatment. The rest is just living out there, having these feelings every now for a period of time or for their whole lives, and not offending and not acting on it. About 15,000 men act on it, but could be child porn or sexual abuse, but also masturbation. They sort of feed this feeling. The rest just has this for a while and is probably very disturbed by having these feelings. Between 13 and 16-year-old, almost all men have sexual feelings, for this age group. Quite often I say all men except the ones in this room, something like that. And if you know, if you have seen the film American Beauty, you can remember that this guy is having these feelings for this younger girl and is struggling with it. And I guess it was a very popular film because it's so much recognition in it. It's not pedophilia, but it's forbidden, it's prohibited. So when you have these feelings as a man, because it's mostly men, right? As a man, that's very disturbing. And you can really get in trouble with yourself and worry and depressed because you have these desires. And the finding out of being a pedophile is a very difficult process, I think. I read somewhere that the suicide rate under the homosexual, the gay youth is much higher than under the straight youth. And I guess with the pedophilic youth getting this sexual identity, it's even higher. So it is a huge thing, it's a big problem. Now, first, what's happening in the Netherlands? I got the exact numbers now from the National Rapporteur on Trafficking in Human Beings and Sexual Violence Against Children. I had to give them their name because they're not official yet. Last year, about 800 convictions there were there for sexual abuse. I was only allowed to use these numbers here, not yet in the Netherlands, but now by this streaming video, they all know it at this moment, but that doesn't matter. And there were 552 offenses for child sexual abuse, about 500 for child porn. The police had much more, well, about 1,200 men were called by the police for sex offending with children, but they're not convicted, all of them. What you can see is that the average prison sentence in the Netherlands is 1.4 years, which is much lower, I guess, than in the United States. And if you see it like when they're in prison for a year and a half and they get out, all of them get out, at the moment you could say there are probably 36,000 convicted sex offenders living in the community after their conviction, so after a sentence. So there are a lot of them in there. And the situation in the Netherlands is that when you get out of prison as a sex offender, the mayor is informed. Quite often he gets in a panic and gets the police to do something about it. The best way to deal with it is when the policeman, the local policeman knows about it, the probation officer knows about it, sometimes a forensic therapist knows about it. And then it can be going very quietly and very well, this returning to the community. But of course there is also the situation where there's public unrest, and I'll come back to that later. I myself was working in a forensic outpatient center for the last 20 years. And it's a big one, it's the biggest one in the Netherlands. We have 9 branches, offices in the west of the Netherlands, and get about 8,000 new clients every year. We call them clients. Most of them are for domestic violence or for aggression, of that type of offenses. But about 180 a year are for child porn and sexual abuse offenses. We hardly get any rapists because they go to the special hospitals. They go in a longer treatment and they're in a sort of prison-like treatment centers. But all the people coming to our offices come in once a week, twice a week for an hour and a half, and that's it. And quite a few, well, not quite a few, but quite a few of them get medication as well, chemical castration, to help them to get through the weeks, to get to their lives without posing too much a risk to be in this outpatient program. We had a feeling in treatment that we were always late. I mean, we got all these men in treatment after their convictions, after they were caught by the police, and quite a lot of them said, I'm glad I was caught because this was going on for years. I couldn't stop myself. I was feeling bad about it, but I just went on and on. And another thing is that we noticed that in treatment, handling the problems coming from being convicted took a lot of time in treatment, because we were talking about they had to move again, because they were threatened, because they couldn't get a job, that sort of stuff. We wanted to work on the sex problem that they have and the abusing. So we thought it would be much better if you could do something earlier in the process. Now, what's the attitude of to pedophilia in the Netherlands? And I think it's very much a dichotomy. It's both there. Quite a lot of people have the not in my backyard philosophy. They're there, okay, but not here, right? But also, like this picture, people know there's a pedophile living there, and they stand in front of his window and shout at him and threw stones through the window. That sort of stuff. Real demonization, real making it much, generalizing every problem in enormous proportions. And there are ideas about the minor attracted adult, so the one who is also attracted to 14, 15, 16 years old. They're all pedophiles for the public, for quite a large amount of the public. And also the idea of reoffending. I think 3 weeks ago on television there was another expert saying that 85% of all of convicted men reoffended. And it was very difficult for another person in the forum to get in. Well, it's not that high, it's much lower. But it's very difficult to get this message across. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is the feeling that there's room for stop it now. Like the film I showed you, like it's accepted. They say, okay, if you don't act on it, that's okay. There's the COSA. You have the COSA in the United States as well, the Circles of Support and Accountability, where volunteers help convicted, returning sex offender in the community to get started again. And this started in Holland about 3 years ago, slowly getting in all the different places of Holland, and there were hundreds of volunteers who wanted to help these men. So there's a sort of strange, contrary position in this whole thing. When something happens, there's these actions of emotion against the pedosexual, these dangerous guys, and on the other hand, there is a sort of, people are open to the science side, the side that says, well, they don't reoffend all of them, and if you can help them, if you can support them, the chances of making a good return to society and not reoffending is much larger. So when you see when somebody comes back in the community after having been convicted, it's good to give information, tell about treatment, to give him that sort of thing. But also in the communities, the mayors have the tendency to make all sort of regulations about where they can live or where they cannot live, because they're panicky about it. They give court orders, and in the end there's sort of a chaos, and somebody has to leave and go to another location. There are more things, of course, happening in the prevention side. Like the situational prevention, schools are built a way that the chances are lower of reoffending. And there's also sexual education for children, what's good touching, bad touching, that sort of stuff. And now because we were working in the forensic setting, prevention programs for the pedophiles, for the men themselves. Well, you already answered this question. So We think it's a primary sexual attraction, susceptibility from birth, early to youth, not a choice. And the thing for us is, pedophilia is not a choice, but acting on it is more of a choice. I say more of a choice because, well, the kind of things you are telling us about when you're in a lower intelligence situation, you're 8-year-olds, that sort of stuff. But you can learn to inhibit your acting. So what can we do for people who have these pedophilic feelings to help them not to act on them? Because we don't want the child sexual abuse. There are websites for pedophilic men. There are prevention programs and there's treatment. Now, this I stole from Sarah Good, who was also invited here in the first, before I got here. She says you can have to provide therapy is important, provide information, help young people who are finding their feelings for children are developing and what can they do about it. And as a society, we should face up with the reality of adult sexual attraction to children. True, but difficult. These websites, I think these websites help a lot of men. In the United States, you have the virtuous pedophiles. I don't know if you know this group, this website. The story that's over there, I'm not going to read it, is on that website. It says, it's not a choice, I don't want to offend, but I have these feelings. And in Holland also, there is the website pedophilia.nl, which is doing the same. It's also having a forum, people can tell their stories. They say we don't want any acting on these feelings, but you can have the feeling, that's okay. And it's just sort of finding a way of dealing with the being a pedophile. The risk of these websites, for me, is a bit the risk of being a subculture. We are happy here amongst each other, and that's it. I think that's a good thing for people who are pedophiles and have sort of accepted being a pedophile. For the younger ones, for people who are just struggling with these feelings, we notice that they can also be very confronting and giving them the feeling, I don't want to be with this group, I want to be normal, I want to be a heterosexual or a homosexual, but not pedophile. So there should be something before that. Now, there are several initiatives in Europe working on this problem. So we invite people who have these feelings to contact one of these organizations and sort of work through their feelings. These are the ones I could find: Germany, Denmark, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. I've been informing people in the southern countries of Europe, like Spain and Italy, and there are no prevention programs there at all, that I could find anyway. First, a little bit about the German program, because it's great. I mean, it's kein Täter werden. You could look it up on the internet. It's part of a big psychiatric university hospital, this program, and it's only for pedophiles. I say only for pedophiles because they have to really have the diagnostic DSM-4 pedophile description, because it's also very important for them to do research and find out what helps and what doesn't help. It's anonymous treatment. Complete treatment is free of charge, completely free. They can come to this program all over Germany, and now they have, the last year, they have 6 small locations where people can go to. Funded by the Ministry of Justice and Health, but also by the Volkswagen Stiftung. You know, Volkswagen. It's very good that they sort of chose to support this program. I heard from them that there are now 40 men in treatment. 86 have finished the program. They're having men who have offended. They have also men who have already downloaded child porn, but were not caught by the police. These are all men who were never convicted for anything. And so it's a sort of a preventive treatment program, treatment for these men to not get in touch with the police and stop their offending behavior. This is the Danish one. It's much smaller. It's part of a sort of a hotline, 2 times a week, 2 hours. But they still have 80 callers a year, and a sexologist is on the phone and answering their questions. Also anonymous treatment on the phone or counseling is possible. Financed by the Danish public health system. Now we're going to the Stop It Now. It originated in the USA. Stop It Now. Fran Henry was the one who, a survivor who started this program here. I understand now it's only a website in the United States because there is no funding for it to have also a helpline. In the United Kingdom, in 2002, they started with the Stop It Now helpline, and last year in the Netherlands. So what we're trying to do is, of course, well, we say it all the time, we have this whole Stop It Now to prevent sexual abuse. And if we wouldn't say, I say that every third sentence when I tell about Stop It Now, because the media try to make it a sort of pedo line, you know, and as soon as it's pedophilia that we are promoting, there's lots of problems. So we try to make pedophilia more normal, more something that can be a sexual attraction, but it doesn't mean you have to act on it. They are just like us. There are 180,000 like them. We aim not only at these men, but also at partners who sometimes are left behind because the man has been arrested for possession of child porn or something. Nothing is there for them, and they can phone parents of children, 14-year-olds, boys who have strange sexual behavior with 6-year-old girls. What's happening? These parents are panicking, and they can phone. It's a sort of a cooperation between In Hope Holland, which is the group that helps to get child porn off the internet, and De Waag, which is the outpatient clinic. And we can offer help anonymous and at no cost. We can refer to treatment. We don't have to report to the police when we know about offending in the past. So once they come in treatment, they can tell everything they have done in their lives, and we are not permitted to even report to the police. When we know of their intention to offend tomorrow, we have to report to the police. So that's a difference in Holland. And we are funded by the Health and Service and Justice Department. And the good thing is that just this year, just this last week, we heard that we have money for the next year. So we can go on for a while. People can phone every afternoon between 2 and 5. They can email. Now we are open also on Monday morning and Wednesday evening. And if there is an indication that professional help is needed, they can get a new telephone appointment with a therapist through another free phone number. They can have 3, 4, 5 of these contacts, and then they can be referred to a forensic outpatient facility somewhere in the Netherlands. They have to give up their anonymity, but we can help them to sort of get a referral from their general practitioner. So if they get a referral from the general practitioner, they can come in treatment. And then we help them to say that they can say that they have problems with the internet, or that they have these sexual problems, something like that, and they can come in treatment. They don't have to tell all. I don't know how much time I still have, but I have a few.
Between 5 and 10 minutes.
All right, I have a few examples of what you get on the helpline, and what you can see is this is just a young man, prepaid phone. He says, very afraid of the confidentiality, struggling with his feelings, attracted to children around 10, has never acted on it, but is worried he will go on to access child pornography. He wants to prevent this and therefore seeks help. He says he's troubled by the fact that Robert M. is a very notorious case in the Netherlands where a man working in a daycare center molested, I think, 80 children during a 4-year period and made photographs and films of it and put it on the internet. And these children were between, I think, 3 months old and 4 years old. So it was really horrible. And it made the idea that every child molester, every pedophile is an enormous child molester. This was again feeding this feeling. He's very happy that with the support of his family. So his family already knows that he has these feelings for children. Well, what's important about this thing is that he hasn't acted on it. Well, he says he hasn't acted on it. But he's also very, very afraid that people will know about his feelings. And that's one of the most important things of the helpline for us, that the whole climate of when you know that somebody is a pedophile or has these feelings for children, he is almost lost. So it's very important to give help before they get to this point. Up to now we had about 300 contacts, 122 men with pedosexual problems, pedophilic problems, 88 partners, and professionals and emails. And 81 have been referred to treatment, and right now at this moment 41 of them are in treatment. So these are all men without conviction who are struggling with these feelings, and we are able to help them. And it's a different group than the group we get after the conviction and after a sentence. We noticed that the problems are different. I have one man in treatment who couldn't resist the urge every 3 months for one evening to go into the child porn and look at all this child porn all the time. And he wanted to be helped because he thought this is wrong. And so I said, I warned him. I said, well, nowadays the police can sort of find out that you're looking at child porn quite often, after a while, but anyway, you take enormous risks by doing this. You have to be aware of that. And he said, I'm very much aware of it because I'm already on my 11th laptop. The other ones are all in the canal. So it's also a very financial problem for the guy. This is the sort of stories that you can get. This one is another one. Very ashamed, and quite often you feel this shame. They often start off on the telephone very slowly, very ashamed, and after a while they can talk for an hour. And this one's had a relationship with a girl 16, as he says, felt bad about it, afraid, and he's a teacher and is confronted every day with girls to whom he feels attracted. He doesn't want to get in trouble because he really likes his work and wants to continue working. And that's, of course, a problem as well, because he is in his victim pool, in the group that he likes most. On the other hand, he's never been convicted, and nobody reports him. So the difficult thing in treatment with people like this is that you can say, well, you should leave your job right now, and he'll leave treatment right now, and we've lost him. So you have to sort of balance and talk about the risks and help him to understand, what do I want to do with my life, or what do I want to do with my sexual feelings. We're also working together with the British Stop It Now on a European evaluation program. And what we like to do is to look at what are the possibilities of Stop It Now helpline in other European countries. We'll have a conference next April in London where we try to invite other European countries to come and look at it. And we are developing a toolbox for other countries to start a Stop It Now helpline and program. So I hope that this will help other countries too to start something like this. So I think the prevention programs are still small. We get support from the government and also from Europe. So there's also something there that wants to have this humanistic approach to pedophilia. We are making a difference. The point that we are saying with pedophilia is a given. It's something that we have to live in. Acting, well, could be a choice. And Our message, of course, is start a conversation, start talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we've had a psychiatrist and a psychologist, and now we have a counseling social worker. So we are going to hear from all of the helping professions. Jim Hunter has a rather unique perspective on this in that he himself was convicted of doing something that was against the law. And he's not here to excuse that or defend that, but he does have the unique perspective of someone with training in the therapeutic profession who has then been through therapy. And he is very critical of the methods of therapy that are common in follow-up programs for released prisoners. So he's going to share with us his perspectives, from which I think we have something valuable to learn.
I'm Jim Hunter. I have an MSW and was a mental health professional for many years. A little more than a decade ago, I was convicted of the sexual abuse of 2 boys. After finishing 3.5 years of my 15-year sentence, I spent 4 years in a sex abuse treatment program. It was group treatment. We met once a week. I'm now on the registry in my home state. I am the sex offender that everybody's afraid of. I am the horse's mouth. And if I may use another metaphor, with regard to human rights in this country in particular, I am the elephant in the living room. As in the Middle Ages, we don't want to go to the horse's mouth. We prefer to search the scriptures to learn what these people are like. I'd like to share with you some observations about what sex abuse treatment looks like from the inside. The free online dictionary defines treatment as the care and management of a patient to combat, ameliorate, or prevent a disease, disorder, or injury. A synonym that is offered is therapy. The term sex offender treatment, therefore, suggests that the sex offenders are being offered a form of psychotherapy. I would like to suggest that the cognitive behavioral model of sex offender treatment that is practiced today is not therapy at all, but one aspect of a never-ending chain of punishments that are imposed on people who have violated one of our society's norms. An effective form of treatment must be based on a more or less coherent understanding of exactly what is being treated. In the popular mind, I think it is assumed that the sex offender programs are mainly an effort to treat pedophilia. In our society, anyone under the age of 18 is defined as a child. This has led to a somewhat confused set of ideas in the popular mind. Actually, what seems to define the offender is his position in a social narrative about who the sex offender is and what he does. The narrative is essentially as follows. The sex offender is a sociopathic perpetrator who imposes unwanted sexual behaviors on an innocent victim by the use of bribery, manipulation, threats, or simple physical coercion. While it is clear that any intergenerational activity between a child, anyone under 18, and an adult will always traumatize the child, destroy his or her innocence, and do life damage to him or her, the perpetrator is indifferent to this fact. He is totally selfish and incapable of empathy. If the perpetrator is caught, his needs no longer need to be treated as of any importance. He is a potentially dangerous monster that must be pilloried, isolated from normal people, and especially from children, prevented from socializing with his own kind in order to prevent the formation of sex rings, and treated in the most intrusive, guilt-inducing, self-esteem damaging, punitive, and aggressive manner to prevent his reoffending. With minor differences in emphasis and language, this is the guiding narrative of our society with regard to the many different phenomena that are all captured in the term sex abuse. It is the narrative that underlies all reports in the mainstream media. It is also the narrative that underlies any sex abuse treatments with which I am familiar. I would like to provide an example of sex abuse that might cast some doubts upon the universal applicability of this dominant narrative template. Heinz Kohut is one of the most important psychological theorists of the 20th century. He says, quote, "I had this private tutor who was a very important person in my life. He would take me to museums and swimming and concerts, and we had endless intellectual conversations and played complicated intellectual games and chess together," unquote. They also did sexual things together, which they both enjoyed. But Kohut felt the sex was more or less incidental. The important thing for him was the relationship. He said, quote, "I was an only child, so it was in some ways psychologically life-saving for me," unquote. Psychologically life-saving. These were the words of the victim. He describes his years with his tutor as being perhaps the happiest one in his life. This is from a biography by Strozer. I have a reference on it if you want it. This, let me mention in passing, is by no means an isolated example. Perhaps the best study ever done on the experience of boys in intergenerational relationships with men is Boys on Their Contacts with Men, a study of sexually expressed relationships by Theo Sandford. I also can give you a reference there. You don't need to be writing it down, or you can, whatever. I begin by questioning this one-size-fits-all narrative that dominates our culture, because I believe it to be the center of all the problems that are in evidence in sex abuse treatment. A man or a woman who engages in mutually desired sex play with a teenage partner actually has very little in common with a man who takes a 5-year-old girl into the woods where he rapes and kills her. And the consequences for the identified victim are hardly similar. Twice during my treatment, I was required to come up with $300 for a lie detector test. The first thing the examiner asked me is whether I was taking the test voluntarily. The fact was that if I did not successfully complete the treatment program, I would have to finish the 11-year part of my sentence in prison that was suspended. These lie detector tests were a part of my treatment. I mentioned this to the examiner. He asked whether that meant I was not taking the test voluntarily. He could only administer the test if I was taking it, not taking it because of coercion. It was a little like someone holding a gun at my head and asking for my wallet, explaining to me that he wanted me to surrender it voluntarily. So I said I was taking the exam voluntarily. He knew I was lying, but that was what he put into the record. But that's only a small part of the dishonesty that was required. The entire point of treatment was that we learn to tell our story in terms of the dominant mainstream narrative template supplied by the treatment leader. I share a little poem with you. Butterfly and flower. We bob lightly in each other's awareness, choreographed by faint breezes, until he alights and snuggles in my lap. He eats Kit Kats from my hand. He licks my stamen fingers, lapping the small residue of ambrosial nectar with his pink proboscis. You see, I was in love. Whether I managed that love well is another matter. That's open to debate. But obviously, the simple fact that I felt myself to be in love was in direct opposition to the dominant social narrative. Yet I was unable to convince myself I was not. Nor did I suppose that treatment would change my mind. That left me with only two options. Either I committed suicide or I lied. I gave very careful consideration to suicide. The perceptive observer may have noticed that I did not, in the end, choose this option. Instead, I chose to lie. The required lying was not so much about facts. With regard to facts, I was able to be fairly straightforward. But I was forced to articulate an acceptance of the dominant template which did not, in fact, resonate with my experience. I think that almost all therapists would agree that careful listening is a key component of good treatment. I was in treatment for 4 years and never once asked about my experience of the events that led to my incarceration. I was told what I experienced, who I was, why I behaved as I did. This astonished me. We have these problem people in our society, these pedophiles. We are obsessed with them, even though we can't seem to get very clear regarding just what we mean by the term. Who are they? Why do they act as they do? We have thousands of them in compulsory treatment, and they are never asked about their own experiences. Well, they're all devious liars anyhow, so what would be the point in asking? Would I have shared my experience? Would I have shared my experience? Was it what my experience was actually like? Yes, I think so, had I felt reasonably safe. But I knew that the question that I was asked had to be answered in terms of the template. I felt only lust, not love. I was incapable of empathy. I was only concerned with manipulating my victim. The younger person had no desire for the intimacy we shared, and so on. So which narrative was more accurate? The one that was imposed upon me, or the one that the treatment leader would never have listened to? What can I say? I was there. He was not. The treatment leader was equally disinterested in what we were experiencing in the present. One of the requirements listed on the contract we were expected to sign is instructive at this point. Quote, I will not make threats or to commit suicide which I do not mean. If I have suicidal feelings, I will discuss these feelings with the group leader or staff of a recognized community emergency agency, hospital, emergency staff, etc. Here we see the cynical assumption about suicide. Talked about suicide, if one talked about suicide, it was probably a manipulative device. Even if we were seriously considering it, it was not to be mentioned in the group session, nor was the leader interested in processing this issue except for the purpose of referring it outside the group. The treatment, after all, was not about our needs. Another point we had to agree to was as follows. I will not associate, quote, I will not associate with any known sex offender who has not successfully completed treatment, unquote. This meant that there could be no contact with anyone of the group outside the group. If we add to this the requirement of avoiding any contact with minors, of being in any place where minors might congregate, the client found himself largely excluded from any social contacts. Who except someone else who's been in the same difficulty, after all, would want contact with you? This was one of the ways in which the, quote, treatment, unquote, participated in society's effort to socially isolate sex offenders and prevent their reassimilation into the community. I was in the fortunate position of being married to my best friend, so my social isolation was not complete. Some are not so fortunate. I'm thinking, as a more or less extreme example, of those offenders who were living under a bridge in Florida. I wrote this little poem about them. What now? Have they nailed you to the registry? Is that you under the Florida bridge? Is that today's tomb in which you lie wrapped in grief, waiting for the huge rock of words to be pushed aside by angels? At the beginning of each session, each of us in turn was required to stand up and state his crime in the sort of self-condemning terms demanded by the master template. We were required to state what abuse we as perpetrators imposed on our victims. This initial exercise framed the session. We were there because we were scum. Let's do a thought experiment. Visualize for a moment a love affair you had. As I give you the information about the questions I was expected to respond to in my treatment, think about how you would respond if you were asked about your love affair. Let's begin with the second set of 6 questions that we were expected to answer in writing. Now think about your love affair, and you're answering questions about that. How does low self-esteem affect your behavior? How do you manipulate others? How do you act when you feel guilty? What did you tell yourself when you were thinking about abusing? How did you act when you abused? How do you push guilt away? Under another exercise that focused on victim empathy, we were to respond to the following questions as we imagined our victim might respond. Among the questions that our victim asked were as follows. You'll notice that the victim is somewhat precocious in his use of language. What did you do to set me up and continue controlling me? How will I know if you were about to hurt me again? Will my friends be safe? Answer those questions with regard to your love affair. But then this thought experiment isn't fair. There was something ontologically different between your love affair and mine, wasn't there? Your love was real. Your intentions pure. If society communicates to us that the very source of our love is polluted, is something to be overcome and to be ashamed of, that does something profoundly disturbing to our sense of identity. This understanding was clearly expressed in a letter I received from one of the several incarcerated people with whom I correspond. Quote, this is a quote from a letter he sent me, I have been speaking to the prison psychologist. It began as an interview to get me into the STOP program, but she did not feel I was a good candidate because I told her I actually like who I am. And I see no harm in being attracted to boys since I'll never get out of prison anyhow. I told her I would like to better understand why or how my attractions got so focused on boys, but I will not hate myself because my desires are not socially acceptable. She seemed surprised at my openness about this subject. Quote, while I was incarcerated, I had a friend of mine share a dream he had the night before. It was a very sensitive and complex dream about the boy he loved that included some erotic overtones. He wanted to explore what it meant. After discussing it a bit with him, I asked him, why in God's name would you wish to report this to your group? He acknowledged that the group would probably use it only as an example of the importance of using the STOP technique, a method of cutting off immoral fantasies at the moment that they emerge. They would not explore with him the meaning of the dream. It would just be an example of the deviant arousal pattern as it persisted in expressing itself in his dreams. I questioned whether the group had a right to know and judge everything about us, even our dreams. Most sex offender treatment at this point sells itself as cognitive behavioral therapy. It seems to me that cognitive therapy offers clients interpretations of his or her experience he or she might find useful. When a particular interpretation is forced on a client, that is properly called brainwashing. And speaking of the client, in therapeutic treatment, the person you are working with is your client. In law enforcement, the state is your client. Clearly, sex offender treatment is not therapy at all, but law enforcement. Is it even good law enforcement? A recent study in the British Medical Journal entitled Preventing Sexual Abusers of Children from Reoffending, Systematic Review of Medical and Psychological Interventions stated that, quote, we found weak evidence for interventions aiming at reducing reoffending in identified sexual abusers of children, end quote. Furthermore, they expressed the opinion that, quote, under certain circumstances with some people in some interventions, treatment could increase the risk of sexual reoffending, end of quote. Of course, no one is interested in investigating the impact of treatment on the well-being of the clients in the treatment group. But I can hardly imagine a set of procedures that would be much better at encouraging them to commit suicide. Could there be such a thing as real sex offender treatment? I am frankly not sure. But if such a thing were to be invented, it would perhaps be necessary to return to the time-honored principles of good psychotherapy. The treatment leader would need to respect the client's narratives, actually listen to the clients, be honest and allow the client to be honest, help the client achieve some degree of reintegration into the larger community, support the client's need for self-esteem, respect the client's boundaries, offer rather than force alternate interpretations of the client's experience, and above all, respect the client as a human being who is not so different from the rest of humanity as many would like to believe.
Thank you, Jim. We do have some time for questions. Are there members of the audience who would like to offer something? Yes, over there.
Does it work?
Yep.
Yes.
All right. My name is Joshua Gravens, and I'm 27 years old. I had a very similar experience to you, Mr. Hunter. However, the scenario was a bit different. I was a 13-year-old who daily had to admit to aggravated sexual assault and went through the same treatment model you did, except for I was never submitted to polygraph, which I'm grateful for. But every day I was told that I could not have sex, that I was a pedophile, that I was a child molester, and was even forced to admit that I had performed penetration on my sister, who was 8 at the time. However, that was not what happened, but that was what was necessary. And so my fear is that we've taken, copy and pasted the treatment model, the containment model, essentially, and have transferred that to kids who, by definition, are the very ones that the entire sex offender registry, the treatment model, was intended to protect. So I guess my question is, why is that still occurring? Why is that, specifically for children, still going on? And do you think that's harmful for children?
Did he direct it? I don't know. You didn't particularly direct it to anybody. Why, you know. I don't think.
Well, first of all, there is a lot of bad treatment out there, and we heard from you about the very kinds of doctrinaire approaches that I think one glove fits all are quite inappropriate. And it's a question of how to educate and get good people into the field. Obviously, in doing this treatment, there does have to be a sense of responsibility to the community, but that should not in any way be contradictory to caring about the people that we're working with and trying to be helpful. And I know part of what I do in teaching, because I teach at a medical school in residence, is to try to prevent folks from becoming doctrinaire and to be open and to be good listeners and to realize there's a variety of ways of trying to help. I've often used as an example, if I'm trying to get my way with a patient, I'm persuasive. The patient's trying to get his way with me, he's manipulative. I mean, we do have to be very careful to be fair to people. But I don't want to leave the impression that what was just described here is universal. I think it's far too often, far too common. I agree with that. But there are folks out there that really want to be helpful, that want people who've made mistakes, whatever those mistakes might have been in life, to still be able to feel good about themselves, to have a sense of dignity and pride, and to be able to be citizens in the community who don't have to wear some stigmata in order to be seen as decent human beings. So I think you described some very serious flaws, but it was like assuming that all of psychiatric treatment is what happened in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That's not the entirety of how things are done.
I think that just let me respond to your question. Number one, I think that the kind of treatment that is offered to children in these centers, for the most part, is a crime. I mean, I think it's a crime against the children. The treatment is a crime against the children. It's dreadful. It teaches them to help themselves. The best thing I ever read on that was an article by a woman whose child went through this. It's called Abused, and you could find it in Salon, someplace in there. If you Googled Salon Abused, you would find that. But I think it's dreadful. The other thing I would say is that at least within my experience, I'm not speaking about Europe, I don't know that much about Europe, but at least within my experience, this is the norm. And I say that on the basis of having talked to a number of people before I got into difficulty who came to me and described what their treatment was. A number of people described it to me. Also, I correspond with people in prison. Occasionally, I run into something that begins to be, at least on some grounds, a little more enlightened. But the fundamental issue, it seems to me, there's a lot of fundamental issues. I won't go on and on with my answer here, but one of the fundamental issues is if this is not intrinsically damaging to the child, if it's not, and there's some data, very strong data, that suggests it's not always, then you are not dealing with a disorder at all, even if the person wants that kind of thing. Now, you can certainly make a case that if they act on those feelings in this society, they will bring grief down upon themselves and upon upon the younger members. It's very distressing to a younger person to find that somebody that loved him ends up in prison. But if you started with that premise, you might begin to build a coherent treatment. Not on the basis of you have a disorder that needs to be kept under wraps, but given the reality of our society, we will try to help you live within it. And that's a very different way of framing it.
Can I make one other comment? How do I put this? It's not necessarily the case by any means that every child who's been involved sexually with an adult has been damaged, and I am the first one to want to stop treating children as though they're damaged goods and they've been given life sentences and all this rhetoric that's out there. But I think it's also important in talking about the responsibilities we as a society have to helping people who have been involved with children is that there are responsibilities for those folks as well. And we don't let 9-year-olds vote. We don't let them drive a car. We don't let them buy cocaine. I could probably give marijuana to a 9-year-old, and that kid might like it and enjoy it, and it might never damage him permanently, but the risk was there that it would, and that's why I think it would have been wrong for me to have done it. So I'm very open to hearing, in particular, what you have to say. I think there are tremendous abuses. I don't think young kids belong on registries. I think we are damaging people through therapy. If we believe it can help, we also have to believe it can hurt. But I don't want the responsibilities that we all have, both as people who might be in treatment and as a society, to respect the concerns that people have. I could argue that as a doctor, it wouldn't hurt a patient if I became sexual with them. But people don't come to me to have sex with me. I could argue that a child in school maybe wasn't that damaged by a teacher who had sex with a child, but we don't send our children to school to have sex with their children. So I want this to be, I want to be very open to the points you're making, many of which I think are incredibly legitimate. But I would ask you please to be open to the fact that others have legitimate concerns too. They're not just trying to be nasty or mean or condescending. I think it has to work in both directions.
I believe Philip Taylor has a question.
It seems to me that there are two models here. Dr. Berlin and Dr. Mulder may have the luxury of having some voluntary, genuinely voluntary clients. What James described is coerced treatment, which in my estimation is hopeless from the get-go. But there isn't enough voluntary treatment going on to have any outcome studies. And my first question is, how do you deal with the fact that there are no good outcome studies that support the efficacy of treatment with respect to reducing recidivism? I wish that we had something like the Duncanfeld process here, but you have to get a little leeway from the legislatures, from the powers that be. I routinely get calls from parents who are desperate. Something has come to light in the family. We would like to get treatment from both parties. What do you suggest? And I tell them, unless you want the accused perpetrator to go to prison and be on the registry for the rest of his life, you're on your own. You better find a way to deal with this within your family and with people you can trust to violate the law in Texas and not report it to the police, because there is no help for you at this point. And so I covet the kind of option that you have. And Dr. Berlin, and I'm sure you have clients that come to you on their own volition with enough money to get treatment. But for the rest of the folks are out of luck, and what we have to offer does more harm than good for people who are on probation and parole.
Can I respond to that? I think most treatment for offenders, abusers who have been convicted is not voluntary to begin with, at least. And I think almost any form of treatment isn't completely voluntary, because the alternative is going to prison for a long time or that sort of stuff. So I think I always start in treatment with getting a sort of understanding on what we're going to do here. And of course, because I'm a sort of representative of the society, I think abusing is wrong. Having sex with children under 16 is wrong. Why? Because it's the law in the first place. Because when you do it, everybody gets in trouble. So at the moment we can't do it in. So this is the start. I mean. Well, once you agree with each other that you want to stop acting like this again, then then treatment is over. You can sort of find your ways together to what do you want to treat then?
Let me raise a question where you seem to be equating morality with the law. It's wrong because it's against the law, is what I heard you say.
You hurt people.
In the toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, masturbation was considered a terrible, terrible thing. and children were punished. They were thrown out of schools. They had all sorts of terrible things happen to them. Their parents had a responsibility to keep them from masturbating. They tied their arms down in their beds and did all kinds of things. The issue was that morality was not well aligned with the law at that point. And the correction was not to force everybody to obey the law, but to become a little more enlightened about what actually causes harm, which is the only real source of an objective assessment of morality. That which is objectively can be demonstrated to cause harm in and of itself. I mean, what else do we base our morality on? Fairy tales and, popular moral panics and the like?
For me, the child is the most important part of this whole thing. And in fact, when you, as an adult, have sex with a child of 13 or 14, and it gets out, the adult goes in treatment or in prison or whatever. The child is feeling guilty and cast out by his friends and seen as a victim and all that sort of thing. That makes it wrong at this moment with these laws. So it's not the morality of what's wrong, but it's more what are the laws at this moment.
You have to adapt to what's real out there. But
If I may just address the issue of coercion, first of all. Many people have come into the program I'm involved with, and what I could say is coercion as a condition of parole or probation, but I want you to know that the overwhelming majority have stayed on far beyond any point in which they'd be required to do that. And so clearly they're staying because they are feeling it's providing help to them and it's something that they want to participate in. The other point about coercion is that we all have that at times. I'm a physician at a hospital. I had to take a flu shot. I didn't have any choice. It's not clear that my taking the flu shot is going to make everybody else safer from getting the flu. That's just a hope that people have. But those are part of life. Someone who's deciding whether or not to take an experimental drug for cancer, we can say they're making a choice, but the doctor's basically saying if you don't take it, you're going to die. We're hoping if you take it, things are going to get better. So in real life, that's there. What we have to be careful of is not to abuse it. I don't take advantage of the fact that somebody has come into my program because society said you have the responsibility to do this. I say, okay, that's why you're here. It's a starting point, but I really want to help you. I want to do it within the context of being sure we have as safe a community as possible, and how can we do it together? So I do think it's possible to approach treatment in that way. There are some sorts of treatment where there are good studies. For example, I mentioned medication that lower sex drive. There's some pretty compelling scientific evidence about the efficacy of that. But again, the politics will override it because we'll get people waving flags about you're chemically castrating instead of there are people out here who want this who aren't being coerced. We don't coerce people into that. I've prescribed over 100 men that form of treatment. I think 1 or 2 of them had that as a condition of probation. The rest took it because they wanted to. But you'd never know that when you hear the media saying we're abusing the rights of people by chemically castrating them. So I'm kind of rambling, but these are just complicated issues. I don't know that we've on the same side of it. We could just sit down and talk about it.
I believe Laura Augustine has a question.
Yes, I wanted to ask Jules Mulder.
Microphone, please.
Sure.
I wanted to ask Jules, because I understand that your perspective is a kind of harm reduction perspective, that a law exists and it's better for people not to get in trouble and not have these things. And I'm sympathetic with that. But I think you said something at one point about getting people to understand how to inhibit their sexual desires as part of a stop thing. So these are not reoffenders. I'm actually interested in what's the message to someone who has a desire that might get them in trouble. How do you inhibit a sexual desire?
Well, for the most part, by not being alone with this desire. Because so that's the start. So the first thing we try to do is that you have to share it, share your feelings, share your problems. You can have sexual desires, you can have sexual preference without acting on it. I mean, in the past I said there are lots of priests who are doing that. I'm not sure to say that anymore. But I mean, it's possible, of course. But you can't do it on your own. You can't do it as a sort of inhibition and being strong all the time. No, you have to sort of accept being what you are, not being alone, have support.
But what's the inhibition? I mean, is it guilt, for instance? Is it guilt or shame? I can't understand the inhibition in any other way.
it's guilt, it's shame, it's being afraid
Yes, okay.
of the law or what will happen, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Great, okay.
Fear of the law is a rational reason not to do things that are illegal. However, you get into this business of don't act on it. Well, suppose you see an erotic picture and you masturbate. Is that acting on it? Is that immoral? Who is the victim? Doesn't that actually decrease your probability of seeking actual people out in the community? We have this incredibly moralistic attitude about, you don't even have your moral thoughts. Or, immoral or socially unacceptable thoughts. And I have a great deal of difficulty understanding that.
I actually would like to follow up on Jim's point there. Milton Diamond, the sexologist at the University of Hawaii, has published a number of studies looking at countries that have relatively liberal laws with regard to child pornography, such as Japan. And what he has found, or such as Denmark during a certain period, the Czech Republic during a certain period, and what he has found was that in those countries, during the period of child porn liberalization, the actual rates of child sexual abuse and offending went down. Mm-hmm. And this gets me to another question, and this is a very interesting proposal Sarah Good made in her book, which is that perhaps we should adopt a rather liberal stance with regard to virtual child pornography that does not involve harming any actual child. And of course, we talked about this subject with Alistair Gillespie yesterday, but pornography that does not involve any actual child abuse, but nevertheless may have a cathartic effect for the minor attracted adult. I'd be very interested in knowing what both of you think about that.
There's no simple answer to it. What I've seen and what I've read about it is I think virtual pornography could help for some men. If you look at child molesters or sexual abusers, there's the sexual desire and there is the acting on it. Those are the two things. So if there's enough self-control, if you have good self-regulation, you're feeling all right, and you are having these pedophilic desires, I think it will work very well. But if you are not strong enough, it can help you to sort of feel more desire and to miss the real contact and go on to offending. So it's a sort of a discussion between is it fuel or is it outlet, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll address it as well. So I hope I didn't cut you off.
No.
Well, first let me make a statement and then I'll answer the question directly. First of all, I think right now the penalties in this country for viewing child pornography are totally out of proportion. They're ruining the lives of a lot of good people. It reminds me where we were in the so-called war on drugs when years ago an ounce of marijuana got you a 10-year prison sentence. So that's sort of the prelude to answering it. The second part, as a clinician, is it is a matter of having a good patient-physician relationship and exploring the issue together, because there are some people for whom child pornography whets their appetite. It makes it more difficult for them, and they'll tell you that, and they don't want to act on those attractions. For other people, I think it does diffuse their sexual tensions. It's a good outlet, and it can actually be quite helpful. And that's why I worry about sort of solving this as though it was a political issue, or even as though it was simply a philosophy of life issue. We're talking about individual human beings who react differently to what may be the same stimulus situation, and we need to be able to help all those sorts of people in terms of the different variants that exist. But I'll come back to what I said earlier, this notion that the primary solution to almost everything these days is new legislation or tougher punishments and so on, I think is getting into a lot of trouble. I think the sort of dialogues we're having here today to try to have input into what would make sense in terms of society's attempt to deal with this is much more what should go on, instead of some politician knowing that if he doesn't sound like he's tough on crime, he's going to lose his job, and then we get these arcane and awful kinds of legislation that goes on the books.
Thank you. Yes, I think there's a question at the back of the room. Okay, we'll have him first.
Hi, my name is Galen Boffman. I'm a director with International Cure, which is Citizens United for Rehabilitation of Errants. And I have a very practical question. I've been personally moved and struck with the compassion I have felt and heard from this panel about this issue. And I recognize that sexual disorders and age of consent laws, these are very challenging questions for society. And probably if there were a clear black and white answer, we would have figured that out by now. But something that the three men up at the panel have and have communicated, I think, to the audience today is this clear, deep felt compassion. And practically for advocates working in this area, I would ask you, how could one advocate for saner laws and educate policymakers, members of the public, the media, while deepening understanding of this issue and the humanity of those involved, because the language that we use to describe this problem is intensely dehumanizing in and of itself. We talk about child molesters and sex offenders or sexually violent predators even. And those labels fundamentally dehumanize the person that we're describing and label them as just the worst thing that we could possibly conceive of in our society, without recognizing that they are indeed more than that, just as all of us are.
Where to begin?
Yeah.
First of all, in terms of your question, how do we help? One thing is to recognize that not everybody who is wanting to be, in a way that seems so unkind, towards, quote, sex offenders is coming at it because they themselves are somehow an unkind person. In other words, the first thing I recommend is to help persuade others, you need to let them know that you understand their concerns. And a lot of these people, they're scared. They don't want their children to be hurt. They've heard that children are ruined for life. It's not true, but they've heard that. So number one is to be sensitive to the fact that people that you could easily say are enemies and dehumanizing them, that you don't do the same thing to all of those folks as what it might be done to someone who's committed a sex offense. The second is education. I don't know how to get the media to stop just sensationalizing and to really try to educate and explain and teach people something they didn't know before. But if I had a lot of money and could do one thing, I'd get myself a TV network and try to get it out there in a way that is news rather than simply the crap that goes on here today. And then the final thing, I'm sure there's much more, is unfortunately there are just some prejudices out there in society. I mean, the history of allowing terrible things to go on because some folks just dehumanizing or are willing to be cruel to the people they dehumanize is out there. How long did it take to get rid of slavery? How long did it take to get to the point where because you're gay, you're not seen as a second-class citizen? So I tend to be an optimist. I think we will get there. I think it should be clear to you that I believe that many of the people that I work with are absolutely decent human beings. They're struggling in a way that's hard for others to understand, and I think that understanding will come and the days will get better. But the problem is, to say that history will be on our side isn't helpful. If you were a slave, 300 years ago, knowing that eventually it wouldn't be there doesn't help. So for those who are in the midst of this and are seeing the injustice of it, I can empathize. I want to try to do what I can do to help. But even in being an optimist, I know it's going to take a long time because there's some deeply ingrained attitudes and biases, and to educate people and to get to them at an emotional level. You can't just present this intellectually, because what moves most people ultimately is they have to have a passion for what it is that you're discussing. So I criticize the media for sensationalizing. We have to educate, but we better educate in a way that doesn't sound like someone's PhD thesis, because unless we capture the passion, that's going to get us nowhere either. So those are just some thoughts. I don't have any big solutions, but those are some thoughts in terms of interest.
Yeah, Jim?
I've given a lot of thought as to what actually produces social, psychological change. And this is my thought, nothing more, but in conversation with other people. And it seems to me that there are 4 different things that can cause real change in terms of either individual or social perceptions of situations. The first is narrative. What stories are told, how are they told, what movies do people see, how are things portrayed? narrative is a very powerful thing. Also, people telling their own stories. Somebody who was a parent of somebody who's imprisoned is a very powerful narrative. The narrative of a younger person who says, this wasn't as you are told it was. That's a very powerful narrative. So the first is narrative. The second, this, for most people, is less powerful, but actual studies and factual information. I talked with an individual earlier this morning who actually changed his mind from reading studies, which I think is laudable. Unfortunately, most people are not in that frame of mind. The third thing is cognitive dissonance. And this is what may eventually make the largest change. You know somebody who's a decent human being, and yet he's also a monster. What do you do with that? Those two facts don't fit in your head well. And so deliberately producing cognitive dissonance and taking advantage of it when you see the opportunity can produce change. The novel about dangerous liaisons is an example. There was an icon, and yet he clearly was pedophilic in terms of his desires.
Michael Jackson.
Yeah, Michael Jackson. So how do you put those two things together? So the cognitive dissonance would be the third thing. The fourth thing would be to appeal to something higher than themselves, their own moral values, their own judgments, their own sense of compassion. So those are four different things, and I guess in terms of social change, I would focus on all of them. I mean, you get into these arguments, well, you need to do this rather than that. I think that's not a good way to go about it. Some people respond to one, some another better.
I mean, I want to add to that. I really enjoyed the commercial that Jules showed us for his organization. I mean, here you have a man or maybe it was just an actor.
Sure it was, yeah.
But at least someone presuming to get up in front of the world and say, I am a pedophile, but I'm also a human being, and I'm working on this. And I have found this organization has helped me. I know as loathed and reviled as it is, actually for people who are, and I think Jim has been very courageous in coming here and admitting that he does have a background there, but also showing us just what a reflective and self-conscious and genuinely kind human being he is, a man who was himself really devoting a life to the helping professions.
I'm not sure, being the obnoxious, aggressive person that I am, I'm not sure I'm the best one to create cognitive dissonance.
No, actually, I think you are.
No.
But remember, I mean, this was part of the movement on encouraging gay people back in the 1970s to come out publicly and reveal who they are. Because what surveys showed was that if anyone actually knew a gay person, they were far less likely to be prejudiced against gay people in general. And I know it takes a lot of courage. It's very difficult given the climate. I really admire the work that Mary Sue and her organization are doing, and I'm proud to see several of her people here at this conference. I mean, even if you're not a sex offender yourselves, if you're a family member of one, this helps put a human face on what we're dealing with. And, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but I do hope that just as the gay liberation movement over a period of some decades has made slow and incremental progress, and we heard from Daniel Williams on Friday evening just how much public opinion has changed even within the state of Texas on these issues. It can be done. But it takes courage, it takes persistence, and yes, some patience. Do we have, yes, at the back of the room.
Yeah, my question was for the first gentleman, Dr. I don't
Berlin.
know. I'm sorry?
Dr. Berlin. Yes.
Okay, my question was for you. I appeared on Dr. Phil's show about maybe 7 years ago, something like that. And he said that this question is pertaining to exhibitionism, not the child thing. I have no issue with that, and never have. But because I suffered from compulsive urges that manifest as exhibitionism, adult women, exhibitionism, it involved. And so I was wondering if you know statistically what the success rate for recovery for people who suffer from exhibitionism is. He said it was 15%. I'm wondering if that was accurate or...
I don't really know. I don't think there's any good studies done on that. I know it can be very compulsive, as you have said, and certainly some of the people we've worked with have required and asked for medication in order to assist them in dealing with it. But I don't think there's accurate figures. What it is important to know, in my judgment, is that it's not, people think if you're exposing yourself, it's going to progress on and you're going to end up raping and pillaging and so on. There's clearly no evidence to support that. But in my experience, and again, any clinician gets a biased sample. I mean, there may be many people attracted to children that never act on it, and so we don't see them, and the law doesn't see it, and we get a skewed view. So the people I'm seeing are often the people who've been in trouble very often, and it is very compulsive, and unless they get pretty intense treatment, they usually continue to be in difficulty. But that may only be an artifact of the kind of folks that get referred to me. There may be people out there where it's less severe and they kind of bring it under control. But it's a struggle. I had one guy who, wonderful career, he was a musician. The group that he was in was starting to get some fame, and he comes back on an airplane over the Atlantic and exposes there. I mean, it was almost like the policeman's at your side. He's a really nice guy, but the urge was just such that he couldn't control it. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer to your question. I don't think Dr. Phil has the answer either.
Yeah, I don't think he does either. But also, I wanted to also say that, I heard some things about nobody having any help unless you have money and this and that, because I heard some things about the model of treatments that are available. And I just wanted to say that in 1992, when I was convicted for the thing that I got and represented myself for at the end of that, in 1992, I did go to California Men's Colony. It's a prison in California, and they offered me, and everything they offered me, I got into impulse control groups, one-on-one counseling, therapy, and something else that you mentioned, another group, process group, and so on and so forth. And I dove into every one of those groups, because I just wanted to, due to self-loathing, self-hate, that did result in a pretty nice gash, on my arm there. I did try the suicide thing. It didn't work. I guess it just wasn't my time or whatever. But I volunteered to go to a mental hospital at the end of my sentence because I didn't want to get out. I didn't feel I was ready to get out, and I didn't want to reoffend. So, a doctor talked to me and said, well, based on Penal Code 2832, I think it was, you can say that you'll reoffend when you get out, which I was pretty sure. I didn't know. I'm not God. I don't know. But I said what he wanted me to, went to Tascadero State Hospital, where he told me that it's a hospital. You get tons of treatment there. And there was no treatment for me there. So what ended up happening was this guard tried to put his hands on me, and I didn't let him, so they gave me an assault on an officer case. On a charge that I should have done 16 months on, I ended up doing 5.5 years straight. They sent me back to the prison, and at the end of that sentence, that's when they told me I had to go back to the hospital, and I declined, and so I represent myself and all that. But I also just wanted to say that much of the therapy that I received, first of all, I think punishment is therapeutic because it gives you an incentive to stop the behavior. For me, I wanted to stop my behavior because it was the source of my self-loathing, my self-hate. So I wanted to stop that, and I was willing to do anything and everything that I could do to stop that behavior. That's just me. If someone else is happy with their behavior, but my conscience bothered me, and that was the factor that came from that led me to want to participate in therapy. And I just wanted to also add one last question, is that I haven't heard anyone mention anything about 12-step programs, which are free and available to anyone. And I also dove into those. As a result, 10 years ago, over a decade ago, we were talking about, the other gentleman was talking about the urges and I believe you also mentioned the compulsive urges being a result of obsession of the mind, constantly obsessing on the thoughts, constantly bombarded with the thought, the desire to act out and engage in this behavior. And I don't have to suppress those urges anymore. I don't have to suppress compulsive urges. And I think, this is just my opinion, as one who has overcome compulsive urges, I think that they're all the same. Yeah, I don't think there's any difference, and I think we make a mistake in making a distinction between one compulsive urge and another. I used the groups that I went to and the therapy that I went through to stop smoking cigarettes, to stop masturbation. I used it just experimentally to see if I could stop things that I've never been able to stop before. And I had success doing that. One of the key things for me that really helped me was the 12-step program. I would go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and while everyone else was saying alcohol, in my mind, I was saying alcohol too, but in my mind, I was replacing the word alcohol with exhibitionism. And to me, it seemed like that helped me a great deal. And I just wonder, have any of you considered, the 12-step model as, a possible solution to?
I had a very different approach to exhibitionism, and I cured somebody of his problems in a matter of about 4 sessions. He was referred by the police. He was sneaking around yards and, letting people see him more or less accidentally and so on. I said, well, why don't you just go to nudist places? It's legal there. You can see, you can be seen. And that's what he began to do, and you just operate within their norms. They have certain norms about, sexuality and so on. And he did that and had no more problems.
That wouldn't have worked for me.
Well, I understand that. But what I'm suggesting is that one of our first jumping off points is, how do we suppress this impulse?
See,
Maybe
that's what I'm saying.
A more logical question is, how do we encourage a pleasurable and beneficial.
But is there a need to suppress the issue, or do you believe it can be removed? Because suppressing it, I don't think
see
is
any
a
reason for removing it. If you find a way of expressing it that is not harmful to other people, yourself or other people, why remove it? It's a part of who you are. For me, it is. Okay.
Let's let Fred burn it.
I want to address the question of self-help groups. One of the problems is there's a tremendous diversity with self-help groups. I mean, if someone comes to me and says, I'm going and it's helping me, I say, that's terrific. But to give you an example, I had a patient who had been a rapist and went to a self-help group where they told him, if you even masturbate, that means you've not got things under control and you're going to end up raping again. And this was tragic. This man ended up committing suicide because this group had convinced him that he just was never going to make it. So again, if self-help groups you're finding them useful as an individual, more power to it. But these are such serious issues that I think that people who need help deserve the best minds and the best quality of care possible. And my hope is that the major academic centers, the places that train the future doctors and mental health professionals that are going to be the leaders in the field will devote much more time and energy to this, so that when someone has a problem like this, they're going to be able to go to a quality place and get the assistance. And I also hope, which is true of our program, that there'll be a sliding scale, because we try very hard not to deny people access to treatment because they have limited funds. I think it's immoral that people who have less money should get lesser care than somebody who has more money.
Okay, we've actually gone 40 minutes over our allotted time, so I really think we're going to have to close the conference at this point. But people can still mill around and talk to each other, and I hope people will do so.
I have a few handouts that people might or might not be interested in,
I have to go to
Right, good, thank you. Excuse me? Oh, yeah, sure. This is an article I wrote on satanic abuse. That you remember the scare.